Hello and welcome everyone to this event by the Asia Education Foundation on the PISA Report on Global Competence. Are students ready to thrive in an interconnected world? I acknowledge our country of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the lands on which we gather, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, noting that today the Asia Education Foundation and our panellists meet on the lands of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the lands from which many of our other attendees gather from across the Asia Pacific region today. I welcome distinguished guests in attendance, including members of the AEF Council, including our Chair and Dean of the Graduate School of Education, Jim Waterston, senior leaders across education jurisdictions and organisations, and the many dedicated educators with us today. My name is Hamish Curry. I'm the Executive Director at the AEF, and also which is part of AsiaLink at the University of Melbourne. Just a few notes on housekeeping before we get started. Just noting the webinar will be recorded and will be shared the following week to those that have registered. You can ask questions throughout the presentation, and this can be done via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And after the webinar, we will be directing you to a very, very short survey, and we would love to get your feedback on this event. You can also follow the conversation on Twitter at #AEFchat. I think it's only appropriate that in terms of understanding this global competence space that PISA has now put towards us, and this historic moment in actually starting to measure this, that we actually look at where these test results come from. So I'm going to share with you a couple of slides just giving us a little bit of context on actually what went on in this global competence test. So first of all, we're going to put up a map and hopefully you can now see that on your screens. And we've actually just quickly collated this data to help show you two things. Hopefully you can make out there are yellow dots which denote the 27 nations that undertook the full global competence test from PISA. There are also a further 39 nations that took part in just the questionnaire component. And of course, Australia was one of the nations that took part in that. Next, let's actually have a look at the framework that underpinned exactly what drove this test, which is the OECD's Global Competence Framework. Here you'll see that there are 4 components of global competence. You've got examine local, global and intercultural issues. You've got to understand and appreciate the perspectives and worldviews of others, to be able to engage in open, appropriate and effective interactions across cultures, and finally, taking action for collective well-being and sustainable development. Now, of course, these are graded in terms of their complexity, and of course, the PISA actually acknowledges that that 4th one around taking action is something that was quite difficult to test for because it does require sort of a physical action to be made, but they did ask questions that whether students had actually engaged in this. One of the things that also the PISA noted was actually trying to define better the notion of global competence, which is something that many of our attendees have asked us in their questions leading up to this event. So let me just tell you what PISA have actually said. Global competence is not a specific skill, but rather a combination of knowledge, skills, attitudes and values successfully applied both in face-to-face, virtual or mediated encounters with people who are perceived to be from a different cultural background and in individuals' engagement with global issues. So how did they do this? Let's have a look at this next slide that actually looks at what components of the test they actually covered. There were 5 test units that covered quite detailed stories, requiring students to interpret their responses to the situations in these stories. There was also 7 issues relating to a range of global and health issues, obviously, as you can see there, that again, students were asked for their responses to. One of the other really interesting elements that came out of this report was on page 160 and 161, I've committed that to memory, is that there is now 6 defined levels of proficiency in global competence that you can actually go and have a look at in the report. And that's something that we've not been able to understand before. So being able now to actually understand that criteria of global competence is a really big step in the right direction. Next, let's have a look at actually what happened in the questionnaire very quickly, because these are the kinds of questions that students in Australia would have been asked. So on the left-hand side, the type of responses to statements about respect and their perception of other cultures. And on the right-hand side, some of the statements relating more to perceptions of global citizenship. And particularly, even just that first one, I see myself as a citizen of the world. And this helps us understand the students' responses to that. In summary, what these translated to was a whole range of really interesting data and tables, which we can look a little bit at today. But of course, some of the summaries that we've seen, particularly from this infographic of the whole group of nations completing that global competence test, you can see, particularly when it comes to respect from other cultures, 82% agreed and 80% disagreed. And you can also see there are two other breakout boxes related to the notion of gender and to the role of advantaged students. And that whole idea of gender and equity is something we're actually going to raise with our panelists today. So let me introduce you to our panelists. So today with us, we have Annette Rome. Annette is the principal at St Margaret's and Berwick Grammar, and her prior roles include senior leadership roles at Lauriston, MLC, Corowa, Carey, and Wesley College. She's been the coordinator of the Centre for Strategic Education in International Education and at CSE and Indigenous Education Focus Group, and an adjunct lecturer at MGSE. She's led the pilot for the Council of International Schools project on global citizenship at MLC and has been a CIS school reviewer. She also sits on the board for principal certification at ACER and is an active member of the Australian Council of Education Leaders and previously the Song Room. Annette is currently completing a PhD in developing international mindedness in relation to the theory of knowledge in the IB diploma program. And I can imagine now you're impressed not only with Annette, but there's some other amazing things I can tell you about Annette too. But let's tell us a little bit about Libby TUDBALL. Libby TUDBALL is the Associate Professor of Education at Monash University, and her work focuses on initial teacher education, higher education research, teacher professional learning, and school strategic planning and improvement. Her special interests in the humanities and social sciences and internationalisation of education focus on the implementation of civics and citizenship education, youth voice and agency, and building understanding of intercultural learning. Libby has also been actively involved in professional associations for Social Education Victoria and the Social and Citizenship Education Association of Australia. Last but not least, my dear colleague and our dear colleague at AEF, SATOSHI SANADA, who's the Manager of Education Design. SATOSHI has spent 11 years as a teacher in the state education system in Victoria before joining AEF at Footscray City College and John Monash Science School, and with leading roles in languages, professional learning, and music. He's recently completed postgraduate studies specialising in education policies in global contexts on student wellbeing at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. SATOSHI has worked in a range of secondary and tertiary education settings in Australia and Japan, and his key interests span across the discourses of globalisation, performance, wellbeing, and STEAM education. So we've got a really great lineup of people here to share with you their insights on this report. And I'm now going to invite each of our panelists with 3 minutes, and I'm going to try and hold all of you to that 3 minutes to try and talk about what came to you in looking at this PISA report. So I'm actually going to come to you, Annette, first to tell us about your perspective on this PISA report for global competence.
Thank you very much, Hamish. And I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm beaming to you from Boonwurrung land and pay my respects also to elders past, present and emerging. It is the case, of course, that this area is a no-brainer. We know that 80% of university graduates in Australia do in fact live and work in places other than Australia. And I applaud the OECD for putting out this report that moves away from the focus on things like literacy and numeracy and science. I'm going to reflect on 3 key things that have struck me as an educator. The first of those is, as Hamish mentioned, it looked at 4 areas: knowledge, skills, attitudes and values. And I'm particularly interested in the focus on attitude and values because I believe that that actually moves into the space of identity education. Now, in Australian schools, we talk often about well-being being a combination of identity, relationships, and community, strong sense of self, good relationships, feeling part of a community, like a three-legged stool. If one of those isn't there, we fall over. But what I find interesting is that most Australian schools concentrate on the relationships and the community bit, and less so on the identity bit. So identity education is a huge field in itself. And I think there are some strong implications for pedagogy here. Curious to note that the report noted that we were fixated on instructional pedagogy. And in Australia, I might add, I think there's a preoccupation with things like direct instruction. The ideal is probably a balance, and I think there's going to be some interesting conversations that come out of that. And this is where projects and programs such as the PYP come into mind, Theory of Knowledge in the IB, where students have a voice and really do have a say in what it is that happens in the classroom. The second thing is I would hate to see that this degenerates into a battle between the disciplines, the language, humanities, sciences, and so forth. And one of the interesting ideas that I think might help us manage this is thinking about Jeff Thompson's interstitial curriculum, the sort of space that is occupying between the disciplines, that honours the integrity of those disciplines, but also allows the exploration of things like identity, like relationships, values, education, and so on. And certainly it gives validity to approaches such as problem-based learning, again mentioned in the report. The third thing, and I'm echoing people like Fazil Rizvi here, who talks a lot about the potential exists now in our classrooms to do great work in this space. We have diversity already in the children with the children that sit in front of us. The report noticed that immigrants in our classes already are predisposed to being open and showing some of those skills that were cited. So listening to them more, and in Iqbal Hassim's words, learning about, learning with, and learning from such young people, I think might be something of interest here. Lastly, our children care. I've been in education a long time now. The children come to us with passion about such things as Black Lives Matter, climate change, the Me Too movement. We don't need to incite them. They are asking it of us. It's about how we respond. So I know that things such as, at our place, we've started a certificate of global responsibility that I hope is kind of getting us beyond those F's, the fashion, the food, the flags, the festivals, and so on. My final comment, though, is I do hope, and I really would love to see our governments taking notice of this report in much the same way they have looked at Australian results in terms of literacy and numeracy and science, because it is as important, if not more important. Thank you.
Very powerful, Annette. And you just went over, but I think I'll totally allow that one on this occasion. And look, if I could really capture what you said, those three I's, identity, really integrated learning, and those issues, really, really well captured. So now I'm going to hand over to you, Libby, to give us your insight. I know you've got a couple of actually images and things to share with us. So over to you, Libby.
Thank you very much, Hamish. And I'd like to have the first slide up, if that's okay. I was particularly interested in Chapter 5 of the PISA test discussion, which explores students' ability and willingness to take action for collective wellbeing and sustainable development. This is such an important dimension because it really gets to the kernel of schools having a responsibility to help young people actually be members of their own local community and the global community, who can live well, make good decisions now, but also into the future. So I think this first piece of data that I've got up on the screen is particularly interesting, that looked at students' agency regarding global issues. If you take a look there, you can see that nearly 80% of students value looking after the environment, and they see themselves as citizens of the world. And nearly 70% of them want to do something about people living in poverty and working in poverty. But the graph goes down a little. Students are not quite so convinced that they can actually solve problems. And there's other data beyond this in Chapter 5 that shows that 70% of students keep informed about world events through Twitter and Facebook, but only 50% actually participate in activities for environmental protection. If we look at the next slide, I'm taking you back a year into March 2019, where not just on the steps of Parliament House, Melbourne, but all over the world, students were taking action. We know that when students are given an opportunity to actually not just learn about global competence, but be active, that they're very keen to do this. And these students, when I spoke to them and asked them why they'd been spurred on by Greta Thunberg's leadership in these global climate strikes, they demonstrated passionate concern, but they also showed that they'd gone beyond what PISA sees as a problem that Annette's referred to, that's teacher-centred instructional practice. They've been involved in critical inquiry. And in the next slide, you can see what this actually means. This means giving young people voice and agency to explore and understand and challenge local and national and global issues, but more importantly, to communicate their views and take action in real ways, which the Strikes for Climate was one way of them saying, here's my slogan, but I know what I'm talking about it and I want to make a difference around these many issues. And in my final slide and in my final point, I'd like to move to how the most important thing that we can do in making a difference in schools is also to give students an opportunity to work in ways where they are powerful, not powerless, and where they can engage with members of the community, politicians, such as the Labor MP Lisa Chesters here in Bendigo, who didn't just stand around and talk with students, but actually gave them an opportunity to do things in the local media, expressing their views and being involved in actions that made a difference in their community. So this PISA test is giving us vital reminders of the important work that schools really need to do. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful, Libby, and really captures actually what this looks like. And to some degree, when people talk about what global competence actually looks like, sounds like, you've given some really, really great examples and reminders that this has been going on for quite some time. This is not just a test at a point in time in 2018. This is something that young people really believe in. And it's an opportunity for them to use their voice in many different ways to try to articulate and actually make sense of the world around them. And there's probably no better person that I love talking to about making sense of the world than my colleague Satoshi. And Satoshi, I'm now going to invite you to give us some of your provocative insights around what we need to start to understand, particularly with our voice and our words and how we talk about global competence. Over to you.
Thank you, Hamish. So I'm probably going to leave everybody with more questions than what we started off with. But yeah, if we can get the slides up. So OECD's image of global competency is certainly an attractive one, particularly those of us who work in tertiary institutions, language education, or organizations like AEF. I'm passionate about other projects like a student voice and agency because it's based on students' response. But I want to take this opportunity to take a little bit of step back and offer a quick cautionary tale. And so there was once a boy called Satoshi Sanada, and he grew up in a small regional town in Japan. He comes from a low middle class family who couldn't afford overseas holidays or had no connections outside of Japan. And from a very young age, though, his education system explicitly taught him to become kokusaijin. Kokusaijin means something like global citizen. That would be a closest translation. Largely because of Japan's political and economic relationship with the US, English was compulsory for every student from year 7 and up. Now it's down to, I think, year 4. So when Satoshi was 17, he decided to come to Australia on a student exchange program because he realized that this was a financially viable pathway to becoming a global citizen. Now, if OECD was to survey the 17-year-old Satoshi, then they would have discovered that he had right aspirations. He said all the right things, thinking in the right way. But what young Satoshi wouldn't have even realized is that his aspirations were deeply rooted in the US-centric economic agenda that he grew up with. So for a young kid from a country town with parents who didn't go to university, speaking English was an obvious ticket to accessing cultural and social capitals that would elevate his status. The image of global citizen he had in his mind was that of a white middle-class male who spoke multiple languages, traveled around the world for work, holidayed in exotic locations, and talked about how passionate he was about globalization and how passionate he was about empowering other people by exposing them to the people, goods, and ideas from a desirable parts of the world. Now, some of you might find it difficult to believe this, but this virtuous global savior story continues to be a common narrative of globalization and education today in Australia. So I think it is about time that we start to acknowledge that globalization presents, as Manfred Steger did back in 2003 as well, but that globalization presents different sets of incentives to different individuals. Now, recognizing that this tension exists as an educator who's worked in Australia, I think this report presents a great opportunity for us to facilitate a deeper intersectional, particularly intergenerational conversations between policymakers, school leaders, teachers, and students. I feel that the questions we need to ask are, if you can go to the next slide, Tash, please. So I think that the questions we need to ask are these on the screen. In other words, what are the economic incentives and cultural biases we embody and reinforce when we talk about things like global competence, general capabilities, and even learner profile, so that we can start to discuss what lies beyond various expressions of globalization and global competence. Thank you. Sorry.
Wonderful, Satoshi, as always. The personal and the provocative is a great combination in this conversation, because again, we're all coming with those often personal stories that change over time, and how that thinking and the language changes over time. It's so deeply important to appreciate. And even if you look at the world of 2018 and the world of 2020, things have changed a lot. There's no doubt at all. So thank you all very much for sharing those insights and provocations. We're now going to zoom really into the second half of this discussion. We now really start to throw the ball around and look at the implications for Australia. Now, it's important to note also for our viewers today, there's not enough time to explore the other nations in this particular event, or engage in comparisons of PISA, which is something that has really worried me for a long time, where the PISA becomes a race or a league table. And particularly with something like global competence, we are not going to do ourselves any favours at all by getting drawn into that. So we're very much looking at the implications for Australia. So as a way to set that scene, I've just come up with a couple of summary statements about how Australia fared. And so I just want to put up for you just a slide. And I know we've had a few slides, but there's a couple of things here just to take note of for our viewers and our panelists here. That on the positive side, students in Australia reported the most positive attitudes towards immigrants, with values in the index that were significantly higher than the OECD average. Australian students also scored very high on their self-efficacy regarding global issues and their awareness of global issues. Australian immigrant students, on average, performed better than their Australian-born peers. In terms of some of the other more challenging elements that many of you have raised in questions leading up to this event, nearly 64% do not speak a second language in the students sampled in Australia, whereas the OECD average is about 12%. Some of the largest gaps in the index of cognitive adaptability was related to socioeconomic status, and these were actually observed in Australia, and these have actually been known from the previous PISA results. Interestingly too, there were significant gender differences in Australia, with girls outperforming boys. So let's close it there. Now I'm now going to put some open questions back to the panel in relation to some of these findings. Let's come back to that first finding about the attitudes to immigrants and global issues, which showed that, on the whole, Australia actually did very well. Can I put it to the panel? Why do you think Australian students fared well in these particular categories? So feel free to unmute and jump in.
If I can jump in, I'm out in schools a lot, as Annette is, and all of us really. And we've only got to look at the very nature of school communities that all over our cities, and now increasingly in our rural areas, our schools are so diverse that the students are living the experience of multiculturalism. And this means that people in some schools from 30 or even more communities are living in a daily manner with their peers and developing a sense of global confidence at home. It's not out there, it's actually in our communities.
Thanks, Libby. Others?
Look, I would agree totally with Libby, and I think that goes back to that thinking of Faisal Rizvi's as well, that by having the diversity, although diversity we know is not enough to actually trigger some of the things that we would like to see happen, but it is the first step, and it is a missed opportunity in many ways if we do not make as much use of that diversity as possible. And I think there's a lot of research into the more we know about someone, the more likely we are to listen to them, to accept them, and to celebrate them too. So I think we are very lucky in Australia.
Thank you. I don't really have a data to say that the ethnic composition of school community, somehow leads to higher compassion towards other parts of the world. I don't have a data to say that, but I do wonder, I guess I do. I mean, I tend to see things from sort of incentives kind of point of view as always. And I think, for whatever the reasons, I think we teach students to say that they care about these things, and they do care about these things, which is really, really positive thing. So I currently run these youth forums where we discuss the global issues in education policies, and there are a lot of students who share that view, and it's amazing. However, where they feel stuck is they have been told that they need to care about these, global, say, climate change or these global issues. They're quite frustrated that the things don't change, beyond that point. So there's a lot of talk about caring about these global issues, which is easy to do when you live in, economically affluent society and English speaking as well. So we have a lot of access to all kinds of information. And again, we live in the parts of linguistic world where almost empathy, compassion, respect have become, there's an incentive, for us to say these kind of things. So perhaps my theory might be that, okay, maybe we talk a little bit too much about sometimes, respect and empathy, and we don't talk enough about actions. And maybe that's leading to this kind of gridlock situation that the young people are finding themselves in.
Great perspective, Satoshi. So obviously those attitudes and that awareness really, really matter. And I think perhaps the point that some of you are making here is that it's very hard to tell from this PISA test how much of that has been a direct result of the teaching that goes on in school, or certainly you can attribute elements of that. And the other might be just the exposure to news and current affairs and just a wider world. And it comes also to your point, Libby and Annette, just about Australia's own diversity, which continues to shift and change. And particularly in the last decade, we've seen ongoing changes to Australia's makeup, particularly of those from the Asia-Pacific region, and how that starts to shape the world we see around us. And I think it's something that schools, and I think you mentioned it, Annette, that opportunity that is right in front of us within our school communities, and also the opportunities to reach out and start to bring in different perspectives. Before I move on, were there any other comments people wanted to make about those particular results in terms of those positive findings on Australian students' attitudes and awareness?
Probably I could jump in and say that it linked to what you were just saying, that a globally connected school is one that doesn't just teach about the world in classrooms, but has a myriad of approaches using school assemblies, getting students connected with their peer groups across different areas so that they're meeting people from different backgrounds, having assembly programs where guest speakers come in and share their experience, bringing the community into the school so that the community is part of it as well. And of course, some schools are more privileged than others, and in a non-COVID world has opportunities for international travel and overseas visits. But increasingly with programs like the Bridge program with the Asia Education Foundation, Many hundreds of our schools across Australia have sister school relationships and are using technology most effectively. And the PISA test itself showed that 70% of students are getting their knowledge via Facebook and Twitter. So we would be crazy not to recognise that we have huge advantages for the use of social media communication to have real connection, even though it's virtual.
Do you mind if I just add a little thing? One thing that has struck me about this whole space is the increased power of silences and the increased potential for listening to people's stories, for not telling, for listening. And it's a really hard thing for teachers to listen, but also for a lot of our people and for young people too, who do like to get out and share what they think on social media, etc. And I do believe that somehow we've got to sort of give more permission for the silences in schools. They're sometimes too busy, I feel.
Wonderful. And I'm going to try and make a bit of use of that silence Annette now, because I actually want to transition now to probably one of the most commented areas that attendees asked about in the lead up to this event, which was about languages and foreign languages. And of course, Australia ranks near the bottom, in particular this global competence test around speaking a second language, and notably too, other predominantly English-speaking nations like New Zealand also sitting somewhere down the bottom too. And so this is something that Australia has wrestled with for decades. There have been many attempts to try and address this, even through the work the AF has done. But when it came to looking at these findings in this PISA report about foreign languages, can I ask our panelists, how did you interpret these findings and what might be done about them?
Well, firstly, the reason why the percentage of students who study foreign language is low in English-speaking countries, because they are from English-speaking countries. There's no incentive for them, and I don't necessarily blame them, even as an ex-language teacher. I think, well, I mean, traditionally, I think language education, particularly the Asian languages, have been pushed under a very strong economic rationale, which makes sense given the sort of policy context that it needed to happen. But yes, there is a kind of I guess there's a lack. I mean, in the case of Australia specifically, I think there is a sort of I think there's a lack of, and I'm sorry, I'm making a massive generalization. You always find counter examples for what I'm saying, but there's a massive lack of, I think, emphasis on the epistemic benefits of learning languages, for example, in language classrooms, which of course is tied up into such, structural incentives such as VC study scores. And of course, it's better to do rote learning and, memorize your script for, your VC speaking exam and all that kind of thing. So these are the reality of the education market that we operate in. But I think, I think there were some, reports written in the past saying, well, we need a probably better narrative for language education. That's probably, that's really fitting discussion to be having right now.
Probably one of the things we need to think about, it isn't easy. Learning a language requires time, commitment, passion, continuous work. And so a token approach is never going to succeed. And we know that there are islands of exemplary practice out there, schools like Huntingdale Primary in Melbourne, Victoria, where children starting prep, and by grade 6, they're bilingual. They learn science through immersion. That school has made a conscious choice to become a lighthouse of Japanese language education, and parents come from many suburbs around the area. So I'm wondering if an approach where all schools are expected to do this when resources are thin becomes problematic. And what we need to do is to create more, I'm using the word lighthouse schools, where families, students themselves choose a commitment to language, to raise the bar in excellence and to put the time required to achieve the kind of competency levels that they can when it's a very focused study.
The fundamental question, sorry to jump in again, but fundamental question is really, I don't think we understand why learning languages is important. I don't think we have the narrative. So we are constructing an argument based on the assumption that learning language is somehow beneficial, which is, as a language teacher, I can see that, but because it's tied up in my job, for example. But what might be some of the, I think this is a good question. What might be some of the ways that we can convince wider audience who don't have a stake in language or international education or citizenship education or IB, to learn the language, above and beyond everything else that can be done.
Look, and we certainly know, and I'm sure all of us, the work of Jolo Bianco and others, who has done some, I think, some seminal work in terms of talking about benefits for better critical thinking, etc., from being multilingual. And one of the things I would like to ask the other panel members actually is whether they are sensing the narrative from the parents is changing. I believe many fewer parents are actually saying, I don't want my children to learn a language. If anything, I think the story is a little bit different, and often increasingly parents are asking, so when do you start teaching language X? Can we start teaching it from kindergarten or whatever? And I'm aware of an MGSE project where they were looking at elite schools around the world, and one of the greatest forces for change was in fact the parents and the families coming to the schools and saying, look, we want to do more language. We want to increase the intercultural competence emphasis. And it was the teachers who were most resistant because they were beholden to whatever system they thought that they should work under. So hopefully that space might be changing a little bit. And I think Libby's example is very telling, that the parents are increasingly being attracted to things like the lighthouse schools. I think that idea is very valid.
Thanks,
well,
Annette.
that's not actually a program as so on. I'm using that as a metaphor.
Yeah.
But in days gone by, that a language was a prerequisite. For example, right back when I started my university study in 1970, to go into an arts degree, you had to have a language. There were incentives, but I do think that there is a lot of understanding about language being an extraordinary vehicle for intercultural learning and understanding, to take your idea and it away from food, flags and festivals. But if you're just having a taste of a language and then the time is not there to develop the rigour, that becomes highly problematic.
And I think too, it's something just to note in the context of this PISA report. Obviously, this test was for 15-year-olds, which case we know, and I would probably just pick up on also what Satoshi has said there, the choices available to our Year 9 students in their education at that stage means that not only the choices for other things I want to explore in my learning, but then the choices for, well, is it the languages that my school is offering, or there are other languages? And so this is a really, really complex space, and one actually that I think AEF particularly is interested in exploring this space of languages, because it really deserves its own, and not even just a webinar. It is something that has plagued Australia for a very long time. We know that some of the languages are plummeting. For example, like Indonesian has halved in the last 10 years in Australia at the final year of school. And so we're seeing this huge cliff happen between primary and secondary. And so what's different then, and particularly with some of the other countries who did participate in the PISA report, is that English and teaching other languages is compulsory. It's embedded in their curriculum. And countries like Malaysia, for example, are actually hoping by 2025 for students to actually finish school with 3 languages. So there's lots of other different values and aspirations there in other education systems where, they're all doing it slightly differently. And Australia will have to find some of its own solutions. Coming back to perhaps Satoshi's point about, perhaps that idea of that rationale and really understanding, what are the drivers for learning a language? Before we move on to our next question, are there any other things you think could be done for our 15-year-olds and their ability to learn foreign languages?
Well, obviously it needs to be taught well and in an engaging way. And one way is if it's hand in hand with studies of Asia or studies of Europe or wherever the language is that is the focus, so that it is it's real. It's connected to the world in the areas where these languages are spoken. And we know at university level, it's very difficult actually to keep the numbers in our language programs because there's not the schools to actually place them in for the practicum element of those studies. So the complexities, as you say, are really strong. But if students see it as an engaging learning opportunity, they're more likely to put their hand up and say, I'm in.
I think it's a competition against other choice, though. That's probably what, yeah, we probably need to think about. So again, we don't have, I mean, currently, I don't feel as though even as an ex-language teacher, I don't think we have a very strong rationale to say, well, you should do languages instead of economics, for example, or, you know, or global politics, for example.
Thank you very much. Look, I'm going to move on to our next question, which again picks up on some of these other gaps in the Australian findings of the PISA report, which was related to the interesting findings between gender, with girls generally outperforming boys, and also the element around equity, which again, we know this gap between advantaged students and those who are disadvantaged and their opportunity and access to global competence learning and experiences. So can I put it to the panel, what do these elements of gender and equity suggest about how schools engage in and access intercultural learning?
Well, I made the point earlier about some schools being very privileged with things like sister school relationships, travel opportunities, going on school trips that are international and so on. That's a very obvious one. And the young people and their family lives, having travelled the world with their families. But drawing on the experiences of students with refugee experiences, with immigrant experiences, valuing their knowledge, seeing that they have a voice and something to contribute from their own experience is critical. I've been in schools where I know that that voice is not actually being recognised in ways that it can. I'm sure Annette would have seen experiences like that as well.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I too am fascinated by the gender differential there. I know my school has a girls' school and a boys' school separately, and it's just fascinating watching how things operate differently. And certainly during this recent COVID time, it is curious to note that it was often the girls who decided to step up and start extra clubs. They were the ones that have been most active about things like the Black Lives Matter movement. We're demanding school do certain things in certain responses. The boys are equally passionate, but in a different way. I haven't been able to sort it out. And in fact, there's probably a whole PhD in this space, I've got to say. But it is remarkable, and I'm not surprised to see those findings, that the girls are more naturally sort of proactive and will get up and challenge the educators, challenge the leaders and say, why aren't we doing more? Again, that could be another webinar, Hamish.
So, further to your point about the girls and their interests, there have studies being done. One of my colleagues did a whole master's on looking at students' involvement in informal learning. And girls are far more likely to join organisations such as Amnesty International, or to participate in a Freedom from Hunger campaign, or to be involved in service learning. So just looking through the lens of non-classroom learning at informal learning, there is a story there that perhaps needs to be more deeply researched, because we can't look at the responses in the PISA test just coming from classroom learning. It comes from their whole life experience. It comes from their beliefs and attitudes. It comes from their families, and it comes from their peer interaction. And when we know that girls are more likely to be involved, I wonder, Annette, if that's true in your experience too. I know you were at MLC at one point, and I know they had a raft of clubs that the students were highly engaged in that were very much related to issues of global equity and social justice.
Yeah, look, definitely. And certainly the girls are very quick to stand up for cases of injustice, in my experience. I mean, boys are too, but the girls will be really, really determined to make the world a better place and take action. And as I said, challenge the leaders at the school to do something about it. Yeah, it would be lovely to do some more work in that area.
I think the point that Libby raised about this competence coming from not just from classroom learning, but a whole heap of conditions that the students grow up in is a really important one to recognize, and that's actually in line with the study that's done by Deakin University scholars back in between 2013 and 2015 called Doing Diversity, which would have been very, very challenging project. But one thing it does show, though the report is quite subtle about this conclusion, is that the coupling of socioeconomic advantages with students' intercultural capability. So there's two possibilities. One is that they are coming from a high capital family, let's just say cultural and social and financial capital families, do indeed increase students' intercultural capability. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that the metric we set up to measure intercultural capability, in other words, our definition of intercultural capability, is a proxy for SEA in some ways. So these are some of the methodological questions that we could be asking about this report as well. In other words, has PISA successfully decoupled SEA from the discourse of global competence? Now, I haven't done enough analysis to actually say that it has or hasn't, but I'd be really interested in exploring it a little bit further.
Satoshi, do you think that feeds into that thinking about global elites?
Mm-hmm. Well, potentially, yeah. I don't know for sure, and I wish I had a more definitive views, but then it is, like as I keep talking about incentives, if you are, say, sorry to use this word, but if you're a white middle class person, there's a lot of incentive in Australia to talk about other cultures, to say, I spent a amazing time in Africa or Asia, and here's a photo of me surrounded by brown and black kids. We know that there is a kind of social and cultural capital that's wrapped around this sort of practice. So that's an interesting, the interesting thing working in this space, because you see these sort of incentives. So yeah, I think, and like I said during my talk as well, I wanted to be the global elite. That was my, I wanted to be an American man with orange hair. That's basically what I wanted to be when I was growing up. Again, if PISA was to survey me, they'll see me as a pretty competent global citizen, because I was learning the language. I wanted to know what's going on in other parts of the world. I wanted to see what the world is like for other peoples, because that would make me more capable in, for lack of better expression, to exploit them. That was,
Thank you, Satoshi. And I think again, it was probably unfair to all of you to try and put gender and equity together in the case of about 6 or 7 minutes, because I think it is a really important point. And we know that the PISA report, the big PISA report that came out last year on the literacy, reading and science and mathematics elements, again highlighted that gap in equity that we know exists in Australia. And so this report does nothing other than remind us that equity gap is still there, and that we often have to be very mindful of it. And this also comes to, I guess, this element of starting to understand equity, not just in a socioeconomic or geographic way, but also in the context of how it works within our classrooms and how we start to acknowledge those that don't always appear on our radar. And this is something that the OECD report does pick up around acknowledging of other minority groups within global competence. And so just as a way to start to move in our final part before we have to close out, I want to sort of come to, I think, what are some of the positive things people can do? Because again, there was a huge raft of questions about this going, so what can schools do? What should we be doing about global competence in our schools? So I just want to really just put up a quick slide that just summarizes some of those points, just really quick dot points that the OECD raised about this. And so again, how education can develop global competence. And so the main reminders that this report wanted to make were the importance of cooperative learning. And you can think about this in a obviously an intercultural context, if you like. the benefits of project-based learning and think about ways that global issues integrate into that. Role-playing and simulation, something that is always important and a big part of programs that we do and many organisations do. A culturally sensitive or inclusive curriculum. And I would reiterate that little phrase about culturally sensitive. It's really subtly important. And of course, something too that we've talked about for a long time, which is that whole school approach. This can't be up to the teacher champions. We need leadership, good governance and curriculum, good, strong teacher-student relations, and really careful selection of intercultural content. And I suppose in one way of summing that up, it's about exposure. It's about experiences, and it's about really developing that deeper empathy of how we start to see the world a little differently. So one of my last questions to the panel then is, how would you advise Australian education react to this report? And what might be some actions you'd suggest on global competence?
Well, I'll jump in. I think one of the most important things is that when this whole school approach is being developed and the leaders and the curriculum teams get together, there must be an opportunity for students to look at some of the big issues of our time. And climate change is clearly one of the big drivers that students are passionate about, but not just climate change, also about the things that they're personally concerned about in their own lives, and ways that those things are common, not just with their peers in their own community, but in the broader global community as well. And so an emphasis on things that the students see as integral to their futures and to uncertain times.
Thanks, Libby.
I would suggest there's no shortage, luckily, in many ways, of ideas that are out there. And I know that if folk haven't seen them, the Council of International Schools certification approach, where each school, in a way, derives its own understanding of what intercultural competence and global citizenship means, based on the context of the school and the nature of the people there. There's the Global Social Leaders group is one that recently I've become aware of and got involved in, which is linked to the United Nations Sustainability Goals. And that's a competition for young people. And I know that the young people I know have got involved in that have been incredibly sort of enlivened and passionate about it. I think there's some rather delightful things, though, harking back to some of the comments of Satoshi that are out there. If you haven't seen Barbie Saviour on Instagram, I mean, they're a bit less active now, sadly, but that sort of global elite white middle class approach. And I know that Ray Davis from CIS put me on to Radiaid, which is Africans buying heaters for Norway because it's so cold. Those sorts of humorous situations, but they flip the story, and they're very good, I think, for raising awareness amongst the young people. But as always, just listening again, I really cannot go back, listening to each other's stories, particularly those stories that might be different to our own story too. I think that's potentially one of the most powerful things out there.
Thanks, Annette.
Thank you. I'd like to, I suppose, build on what Libby and Annette have said. I think a couple of things. I think, again, I'm a very cautionary sort of person, as you'd probably worked out. But first thing I want to say is that there is a kind of I might say common pitfall in student voice discourse that we celebrate today, which is that we unequivocally value what students have said, which we want to, of course, we do, but then at the same time, the discursive, I think, effect of that is that we are actually not taking on our responsibility as adults and educators to actually provide them with the adequate capability for them to articulate their voice well so that they are heard. With that comes the kind of assertion skills and so forth. So in a sense, it's easy for us to say, well, let's listen to what the students have got to say. But two things: if we don't have the sort of like a intergenerational empathy to actually understand what they're saying, then that falls onto sort of deaf ear. So students won't be. They won't feel that they're being heard. That's one thing. And the other one is like, if we don't set them up for success, then creates a sort of sense of disenchantment. So these are some of the issues with the student voice, which we now have as a part of the teaching and learning framework in Victoria. I think there's some concepts I fear maybe starting to be eroded a little bit. And that same thing goes with the empathy as well. Like, we talk about empathy quite a lot in the AEF programs too, but when we listen, I think it's hugely important that we don't impose our generational and class filter when we listen to people's stories, because that's also common too, So we need to learn to recognize again the incentives and biases that we commonly operate, so that we can have a little bit better understanding about how we understand other people's stories.
Thank you so much, Satoshi. I think you've really wrapped it up and brought it home to a lovely point. And obviously too, that really powerful way in which we have to, and you've raised this point too today, Annette, about being able to listen, being able to really observe, being able to ask the right questions. I mean, this is where things like empathy is a lifelong skill, and these are the elements of where PISA has tried to actually, for the first time, produce data that tests for these things. The knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values of 15-year-olds across 66 nations, and the ways in which they start to interpret and see the world. Well, today, hopefully we've given you a little bit of an insight into this particular report, and also to some understandings of what this means to Australia. I want to take this opportunity to again thanks our amazing panelists for their time and their expertise. To Annette, thank you. It's always wonderful to have you involved. And we actually forgot to tap into your science background, actually, that is a lovely analytical lens I know we've had conversations about before. To Libby, always wonderful to have your passion here as someone that has spent their career pursuing this space of developing deeper understanding of issues, agency, and intercultural learning. It's always wonderful to have your input. And Satoshi, I absolutely love the way that you can pick apart the language, ask those really hard questions, and really challenge us to start to check ourselves about how we're talking and how we're seeing the world. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you also to the hundreds of people that have joined this event and the kind of engagement that you shared. We were so impressed with the questions that you've asked, and we really want to try and see if we can regroup and write about more of the amazing questions that were asked that we didn't have time to address, and to all the other comments and questions highlighted during the event today. I think I just want to end with a couple of final comments actually from the OECD. And this is actually a statement from this PISA report. By appreciating the cultural diversity of the communities to which they belong, young people can learn to live together as global citizens. While education cannot bear the sole responsibility for ending racism and discrimination, it can teach young people the importance of challenging cultural biases and stereotypes in multicultural societies. And it's something that I think is important for us to really take home, not just for our students, but for ourselves as learners. A recording of this session will be made available next week to those that have registered. So if there are things you want to go back and revisit or keep the chat going on AEF chat. And once you leave this webinar, we're going to again ask you to just complete a couple of quick questions on a survey. We'd love to know what you thought about this panel and this event so that we can look at doing more. Obviously, you can find out more about us through our website. And also, I would remind our viewers at the moment, if you want more, next Thursday night, there is an upcoming Teach Me that's being hosted looking at intercultural understanding and engaging with Asia. So that's Thursday, the November 12th. I strongly recommend you joining that Teach Me and hearing directly from other educators about what's happening in this space. We continue to look at this PISA report as an opportunity to do more. AEF is currently working on an upcoming article investigating this PISA report in even more detail and exploring the results from our wider Asia-Pacific neighbours. I perhaps would like to close today by using just one more statement from this PISA report. and one that has been rolling around in my head for the last 2 weeks in reading over those 426 pages. Students should not only be able to navigate this complex environment, they should benefit from it. And I think today we've had the opportunity to look for the positives amongst this report and look for the ways that Australian students and students everywhere can benefit from global competence. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and all our amazing guests. And we look forward to seeing and engaging with you soon. Thank you and goodbye.